Hello everyone, Ailuromage, the Magic History Cat here, and today I will be talking about the Sin Eaters in Final Fantasy XIV. This video will primarily focus on the Sin Eaters in general and some interesting connections between them and the Cardinal Sins, and I will talk more specifically about the Light Wardens and some other details about the Sin Eaters in a later video. Players of the game know that Sin Eaters are the primary enemy force during the story of Shadowbringers, and they are the result of an intense concentration of light warping living beings. For the most part, Sin Eaters have lost sentience or at least operate on a lower level than the primary humanoid races in-game and seek to feed on Aether, often converting their victims into more Sin Eaters. So what actually is a Sin Eater in real life? Well, what we understand to be Sin Eaters comes from primarily the 17th century Wales. Sin Eaters were individuals that would take the sins of the recently deceased upon themselves and cleanse them. They would do this through various rituals involving the use of food, where the sins would be contained within the food, sometimes making contact with the body with the food in order to accomplish this, and then they would consume the food to remove the sin. The food used is usually mentioned to be breads and ales. There are various texts and manuscripts that bring up the term, and historians have discussed this in interest for some time. Some of these texts are written by people that claim to have witnessed sin eating firsthand as recent as 1800s, with a good chunk of similarities among them. So Sin Eaters in real life seem pretty different from Sin Eaters in Final Fantasy XIV, but let's just talk about the Sin Eaters in the game. There is a long list of various Sin Eaters you encounter in Shadowbringers of different shapes and sizes, but what is immediately noticeable, of course, is how they are all named. Pretty much all of them are prefixed by the word forgiven and named something related to what are called the Cardinal Vices. The Cardinal Vices, also known today as the Deadly Sins, are pride, greed, envy, wrath, gluttony, lust, and sloth. However, initially, they were slightly different. The origins of the Deadly Sins is attributed to a monk named Evagrius all the way back in the 4th century. Evagrius was an ascetic and had developed an idea of what fleshly desires or behaviors are the sources of all sin and the primary deterrents to a proper spiritual life. So there were initially 8. Over time, after translations from Greek into Latin, revisits to scripture, and just various developments by the church, we now have 7 deadly sins as we know them today, and they are fully recognized by the Roman Catholic Church as the capital sins, as they are called and written in the Catechism. Just keep in mind that this is not written in scripture in this way. The cardinal vices are an interpretation of the text to make understanding scripture easier. It is a means to define the roots where all sinful behavior stems from, as sin takes many forms. So looking back at the game, one of the Sin Eaters is directly named after Vainglory. As a quick side note, pride and vainglory seem the same, but let's just go over the difference, or at least how they were viewed historically in Evagrius' time. Pride is an inward egotistical quality, the feeling of superiority over others, so much so that you essentially don't care about the people around you. You feel you are above them, and in some cases don't even owe anyone the time of day. Vainglory is an outward egotistical quality, the desire of being glorified, venerated, and worshipped. You want to be noticed, and you want to be popular, so it's essentially vanity. For the other sins, to my knowledge, there are no other Sin Eaters named directly after any of the other vices, but they carry names of sinful behavior that stem from them. The ones that I think are closest are: forgiven conceit is pride, forgiven extortion is greed, forgiven jealousy is envy, forgiven enmity is wrath, forgiven revelry is gluttony, forgiven venery is lust, and forgiven conformity is sloth. And the rest are the behaviors that flow from the vices, that are the source for where all sinful behavior comes from. From all the Sin Eaters I am aware of, here is where I believe they all fall. Additionally, just keep in mind that some of these can definitely fit into more than one category, but I think they fit well where they are all placed. Also, I am leaving Vainglory out of this because of the previous explanation covering it. So you probably noticed that there are a lot in Pride, which makes sense as historically pride was considered to be essentially the worst sin, sort of like the leader of sin, as biblically, pride is the first and original sin committed by Adam. So for pride, we have conceit, which is excessive pride, ambition, and being too ambitious is a trait of pride. Cowardice may seem odd to put into pride, but cowardice, or more specifically fear, has been attributed as a trait of vainglory, being that fear causes a person to behave in such a way. So cowardice in some cases can lead to or be an effect of pride, a fear or anxiety of not being appreciated or desired. Disobedience, well, biblically, being disobedient to God is a trait of pride. Believing in the ability of oneself over God is the highest form of disobedience. It's the first sin, the original sin, or ancestral sin as Orthodoxy calls it. Hypocrisy biblically means you're seeing yourself as something you are not. According to scripture, not recognizing yourself as a fleshly being born under the effects of original sin is hypocritical. For pedantry, excessive pedantry is an overbearing, almost toxic approach to details and perfection, basically a form of vanity. Rebellion, similar to disobedience, rebellion against God is sinful and a form of pride, and prejudice stems from a feeling of superiority over another individual because of differences, which is another form of pride. Next is greed. Extortion, bribery, and deceit are essentially all forms of manipulation, gaslighting, and lying to benefit yourself at the expense of someone else, and these are usually done to amass power, wealth, or fame. Flattery is biblically also a means to manipulate or entrap someone to gain something from them. Next is envy. Jealousy, along with covetousness, is the closest synonym to envy. In fact, it's one of the 10 commandments to not covet, to not be jealous. And thievery stems from coveting something that isn't yours and owned by someone else. Next is wrath. Enmity is an extreme and deep-rooted hatred. A grudge is a form of long-lasting disdain or hatred. Clamor is biblically associated with wrath and anger. Cruelty is hateful treatment of another person, and gossip is harmful speech about another person, usually stemming from hatred of that person. Next is gluttony. Revelry is usually associated with excess indulgence in alcohol, food, and festivities, and whimsy may seem strange here, but gluttony isn't just about food. The vice of gluttony is also associated with just excessive indulgence in something to the point where it becomes your god in a sense. So being taken by whimsy in excessive capriciousness would be considered bad and a detraction of your spirituality. Next is lust. Venery is an old word and in this context relates to the hard pursuit of sexual gratification. Obscenity is usually attributed to being sexually offensive or revealing. Dissonance, in this context, dissonance can be attributed to a conflict of desire or love, which could lead to a corruption of that love stemming from lust. And lastly is sloth. Conformity can be attributed to conforming out of comfort or laziness. Being complacent in the world or in the flesh is sinful. Reticence in this context relates to being easily controlled or coerced because of a lack of desire to speak out or resist. Folly is foolishness and a lack of desire to conduct oneself appropriately, considered to be a lazy approach to living life. Ignorance is just being ignorant and uninformed, considered to be a lazy approach to learning and a refusal to improving yourself by living in ignorance. Apathy fits here because sloth is also about a lack of care or concern for the health and safety of others, so being apathetic is sinful. These are all of the sin eaters that I am aware of that appear in-game. They are representations of behaviors stemming from the cardinal vices, which are the other side of the coin to what are called the cardinal virtues. The cardinal virtues are fortitude, justice, prudence, and temperance. Later on, Christianity would add 3 additional called the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. However, the 4 that originated in ancient Greece are the most prominent ones mentioned throughout history on a much larger scale. If the term cardinal virtue sounds familiar, that is because Shadowbringers introduces this term in the form of 4 of the former warriors of darkness in the first that became sin eaters. Renda Ray becomes Andrea. Brandon becomes Decaiusine. Nilebert becomes Phronesis, and Lamet becomes Sophrosyne. So the most powerful warriors fell to the light, were converted, and became extremely powerful forces against the darkness. Andrea is fortitude, symbolized by Hercules. Dicosine is justice, symbolized by Daimona. Phronesis is prudence, frequently discussed by Plato in his writings. And Sophrosyne is temperance, also often written about in Greek text, especially as a means to criticize hubris in literary works. So in Shadowbringers, we see the cardinal sins and the cardinal virtues connected in a really interesting way through its story surrounding the concepts of light, darkness, sin, and virtue. So to reconnect back to the real-life Sin Eaters, they were individuals that took sin away from another through ritualistic eating. Sin Eaters in-game feed on aether, which every living creature has in varying amounts. So upon feeding on the aether, the person is then reborn in light as they are forgiven for their sins, taking on their new form and life as a forgiven vice. As for the Warriors of Darkness, they were just so powerful that they became virtues. I want to thank you all very much for watching, and I hope this was fun or interesting in some way. I never really know how these videos will turn out, but they take a lot of time to make, so if you enjoyed it, please leave a like or comment or tell me what you thought. Also, subscribe if you don't want to miss my next video, where I will delve more into the Light Wardens and some other interesting details about the Sin Eaters. Thank you again, and remember to pet a cat today.